Good morning. I'm going to call to order the Water Commission meeting. And Commissioner Arturo Keller is absent today, and looks like Commissioner Davis might be as well for at least the start. Any changes to the agenda?
No changes to the agenda.
Okay. Any public comment on items not related to the agenda? Don't see anyone, so we'll keep moving on to consent calendar. Do we have any questions on the consent calendar?
I don't. I'll move to approve the...
Second.
Okay, and...
It's a peppy crowd, huh?
I know. We're going to wait 30 seconds for Commissioner Davis to join us. Maybe he wants to see if he's got any questions on consent. Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
Any questions on the consent calendar?
None.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second from the two Michaels. All those in favor?
Aye.
And none opposed, so that carries. And we'll move on to administrative items, appointment of selection committee representative for the enhanced urban water management plan. I know Commissioner Keller had said that he was interested in this. Is anybody, you're not going to be here anymore, so.
I'd be unless you want to.
I think we only need one
Only need
person
one?
or two people?
Just
I
one.
make a motion
one?
for Arturo.
Okay.
I'll second that.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. All in favor for
Aye.
appointing Arturo? Aye.
Aye.
Great. Okay, so Arturo is on. Introduction to water rate development.
Yes, thank you, Chair Bernie, Water Commissioners, Councilmember Sneddon, Malcolm Hamilton, Administrative Analyst in the Water Resources Division. I'm joined today with Sean Korn from HDR Engineering. We had brought an item before. This was the firm we had selected. You may remember Sean from just about 2 months ago when we did, a few months ago when we did wastewater rates. So he's back here and we're doing water rates. Today our presentation will cover a couple things. First, Sean will go through the rate setting process. He'll move somewhat quickly because I think everyone here has seen a similar presentation. There's a similar rate setting process for water as there is for wastewater. And then after that, I'll go through some of our key focus areas. It will be policy and some of the impacts to the rate model that we see coming up. I think if you remember about 3 years ago, August 15th, 2017, I remember it very well, but that was the day we adopted rates, a 3-year rate schedule. We'll be looking to adopt rates again for likely 3 years. Although we've seen an improvement in the water supplies and we've moved to a stage 1 drought condition, this modeling effort is just as dynamic as it was when we were in the drought, and you'll see some of that. So I think 3 years is going to be about as far out as we can get. We talked about 5 years. I think it's just going to be too much variability in the inputs to get that far out. The other thing, and Sean will touch on this, is we're still continuing to experience some rising costs. So our general maintenance of our facilities and upkeep of infrastructure, we're seeing CPI increases or inflationary increases about the 2% and 3% mark. We have salary and benefit increases as well. So as much as we are trying to tamp down on the potential rate increases, we do have rising cost elements that we need to deal with. And we'll talk more about that, but I'll turn it over to Mr. Korn to go on.
Thank you. Good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. As Malcolm said, the approach for establishing water rates is very similar to the wastewater rate process we went through, but obviously it's more focused and distinct on your water costs. And so you have a very comprehensive plan and several sources of supply that we need to consider as we go through this process. And so that really is going to be how we tailor this down and highlight some of the key areas, and Malcolm will dive into those more as we go through this process to work with the Commission and the ad hoc committee so that we can go through and develop those policy decisions and recommendations as we develop the analysis. So I'll start off with a little bit of the purpose of the study, overview of the process, and then Malcolm will talk about some of the key policy issues and the next steps that we have. And as Malcolm mentioned, one of the things that all utilities are experiencing is increasing costs, whether that be electricity, chemicals, all those inflationary components need to be considered as we go through this process, as well as any additional costs that may be needed. That can include some capital projects that are necessary to maintain the system, the renewal and replacement, or just the maintenance of the existing system. That all needs to be incorporated into the analysis so we can develop a long-term sustainable revenue picture for the water utility. So that's one of our primary goals, is to make sure we map this out. We're looking out over 10 years with a focus on the next 3 years for the rate setting process. And so that'll really be where we can hone in on those assumptions in that 3-year period based on what we know today. As we go through this, we need to make sure that we meet the requirements of California Constitution, Article 13D, Section 6, also known as Proposition 218. So similar to the wastewater discussion, we need to make sure that we have proportional rates for each of the different customer classes of service. And for you, historically and continuing on, that really comes back to your prioritization of your water resource costs. So the different resource stacking and how that impacts different customers that use the water on the city system. As we go through the process, we're going to incorporate the city's financial policies and metrics. That's reserve funding, making sure we have adequate reserves from a year-to-year basis. What does that look like, short-term, long-term, as well as debt service coverage and other financial metrics as we go through the process. One of the key elements of any water rate study is projecting overall consumption or demand levels, right? How much water are customers going to use over the next 3 and 10-year period? And how does that impact both our revenue picture and our expense picture? Because as we need more water, we have to produce more water. And so how does that drive the analysis? And so as we go through the process, we're going to look at different scenarios or sensitivity analyses to consider what that might look like. And then ultimately, we're going to base this on the city's specific data, your customer information, your expense information, the cost increases you've seen over the past several years to give us a projection of cost based on generally accepted methodologies. So that is primarily outlined by the American Water Works Association M1 manual, Principles of Water Rates, Fees, and Charges. So this is the water side of the table where we have that manual, the AWWA M1 manual for that. It's the same 3-step process, just tailored to water, where we have our revenue requirement, cost of service, and rate design. And again, our revenue requirement is that financial picture. What do we need in revenues over this next 3 years, and what are those adjustments to rates that are necessary? But to meet the requirements of Prop 218, we have to do this cost of service analysis. So how do we proportionally and equitably allocate the cost to the different customer types that you have? So again, residential, multifamily, commercial, irrigation, how are they all allocated costs based on how they use your system? Based on those two analyses, then we can design rates that incorporate any other objectives or goals, and we'll talk about those a little bit, but it's revenue stability. It may be continuing your conservation. How do those impact the overall structures and how you ultimately bill your customers as we go forward? So on the revenue requirement, I've just got 2 slides for each of these different components. As we go through this, the overall revenue requirement determines the level of revenues needed over this next 3 and 10-year period with the focus on the 3 years for the rate setting process. We do want to make sure we're using prudent financial planning criteria. That's the reserve target levels. That's debt service coverage ratios. That's making sure we're following all of the financial policies that the city and the utilities have established as part of this. We're looking at that 3-year window for rates. We are looking long-term as one of the other tasks in the study so that we can incorporate all additional information, long-term projections. So we're looking down the road, right? We don't want to miss the corners, the bumps that are in front of us so that you can plan accordingly for your rate setting process. We also want to make sure that the water utility is a standalone utility. It's an enterprise fund, and we want to make sure that revenues from water sales adequately and prudently fund the operational and capital activities of the utility. And we use the cash basis, and we went through this on the wastewater side as well. It's essentially looking on a year-by-year basis. What are your O&M needs, your capital needs, any transfer needs to fund any other projects, and annual debt service payments to meet your overall revenue requirement. So as we go through this, we'll have different goals and objectives. These are just a handful of them. We've got 4 kind of primary goals here. As we go through this, I think the biggest one is the bottom right corner, consumption levels for revenue projections. That ties in with your supply planning. It ties into our expenditure projections as we go through this. That'll be a big aspect of this study and how we project that and what that looks like. It may also start looking at levels of services. You know, what are those projections of O&M going forward? Are there changes that need to be considered as you go through this as the utility continues to mature and change over time to reflect the needs of your customers? Are there other programs, practices, capital infrastructure that's going to drive this? So as we go through this, we'll want to make sure that we consider all these, and that's part of what will come back to the commission and the ad hoc committee on those policy discussions and kind of key assumptions as we go through the study. So that gives us our overall revenue picture. Then we get into the allocation of costs. And again, really, a cost of service is the method outlined in the AWWA M1 manual to equitably allocate that revenue requirement to the various customer classes of service. So it's accepted as a methodology that's fair and equitable. We really focus on the proportional and equitable component of that. And what it tells us is, are your current rate structures appropriate? And are they collecting the right amount of revenue from each class that reflects the cost or the burden they place on the system? And ultimately, that brings us back to meeting the proportionality requirements of Proposition 218. Tells us at the end of the study, do we need to adjust rates for one class more or less than the overall system average? And that's an important distinction as we go through the process, that our revenue requirement tells us what the size of the pie is. How much revenue do we need in each year? The cost of service then tells us how much revenue we need from each customer class and how we're going to collect that through the fixed and consumption charges. And that's really what we need to have for Prop 218 is that number of here's what our consumption charge is, here's what our fixed charges are going to be as we go through this process. So as we go through this, we'll really focus on customer characteristics. That comes back to that consumption that's going to be used in the revenue requirement to drive revenues and expenses, but also looking at each individual customer class and the prioritization in the bottom right corner of the water resources and how we've allocated those to different customer classes and what that looks like on a cost basis as we move forward. So once we have those first two pieces, then we can get into the rate design analysis, and really it's these steps here. We take the first two analyses, revenue requirement and cost of service. That gives us our number. And then it starts looking at what are our goals and objectives, right? And we need to incorporate these early. This will be something that I'll come back to, at the very least, the ad hoc committee like we did on wastewater, but possibly as we work through the process with the entire commission to look at those goals and objectives and how do they drive that cost of service and what assumptions are made as part of that. And ultimately then those rates produce the revenues that are sufficient to meet the system needs as well as the cost of service from each customer class. And then those are cost-based, equitable, and proportional rates as long as we're using that cost of service methodology. So some of the goals here, these are kind of our typical rate setting goals. We want to make sure that we have revenue sufficiency and stability. So sufficiency is meeting our overall costs. Stability is not wild swings from year to year in our revenue. That's a key element of this given the drought we all went through and then also changes in patterns as we go forward. We want them easily understood and administered, right? We want customers to understand why they're being billed the way they are, and we want to make sure that customer service staff is able to explain to them why it's being billed that way. If nobody can understand it, probably not the greatest rate structure we have in place, right? So we want to make sure that we maintain that. You have a very good and easily understood approach now. Affordability is an issue that's discussion that's happening all across the country right now. So how can we make rates affordable? And that's challenging, and it's a heavily driven cost by infrastructure needs, right? And that's not something everybody always sees. They turn the tap on the waterworks. They don't realize there's 8 and 10 and 12-inch pipes in the ground in front of their street that have to be maintained, replaced from time to time as we go through this. So that's an issue that will come back. That's a task that we'll look at as part of our study to provide some information to the city and the commission on what options are out there and how this can be dealt with. Conservation or efficient use is a key. We want to make sure that we're equitable and non-discriminating. That's our cost base, that's our cost of service, and that leads us right into having legally defendable rates. Really, the legally defendable and the last one and the first one at least for the sufficiency component, are givens, right? Those are goals we are going to meet no matter what we're doing. We're going to have legally defendable rates, and they're going to be sufficient to recover all your costs. Everything in the middle are things that can shift from side to side as we work through the process. So there are some terms I have already used, but I wanted to define those a little bit more for you all. Structure versus level. So structure is how you charge the customer. So we've got a fixed charge, we've got a tiered consumption charge. That's the structure of it. The level is how much revenue we're collecting through that structure. And so those are two of the terms we use when we talk about rates. We also talked about fixed and variable, or fixed and consumption-based charges. The fixed charges, they are what they are. They're not based on any usage. Typically, they'll vary by meter size. And you can have multiple fixed charges. There may be a fixed charge that reflects the meter cost. There may be a cost component for the customer service. It's how we roll those all together as part of the cost of service to come back with the final. Our variable or consumption charges are obviously based on that metered water consumption for each customer. And then really the unit isn't the big piece. It's how we explain that to the customers. But ultimately it's charged in HCF, 100 cubic feet or 1,000 gallons or gallons. Ultimately we just need to know how we're doing that so folks understand what that billing practice is. So as we go through this, we'll take a look at the primary goals and objectives. We'll look at the fixed and variable components as we go through that cost of service, and then establish those rate structures as part of this. So we'll look at all of the structures for all the customer classes, make sure they're contemporary, make sure they reflect industry standards, and then ultimately come back with proposed rate structures that reflect our cost of service and rate design. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Malcolm to walk through some of the key areas.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Corn. If there's any questions, take stop now or keep going.
No, I think Councilmember Snedden has a question. Let's do that.
I don't, thank you, Chair. I don't know if we're going to get to this or not, but you have the key policy considerations. Are we going to discuss? Oh, those are coming.
Yeah.
Yes, Councilmember Sen will be going through those right now.
Thank you.
Okay, so I've organized these. I had them as a list in your staff report that was provided, but there's three kind of general areas. The first that we're looking at is what are the impacts to our revenue requirement, and so as Mr. Korn explained, how much money are we going to need to continue to operate and meet our goals? And really, the water supply agreement with the Montecito Water District, the potential water supply agreement, really looms quite large over this modeling effort. So there's two key components to this that will impact this 3-year rate study. The first being the execution of the agreement would require that the city construct a conveyance pipeline, which would deliver water from the desal plant and get it all the way up to Cato treatment plant. The Montecito would participate in the cost of that pipeline at the time of if and when we expand the plant. And so up front, the city would likely pay approximately $20 million for this construction project, and it would come out of reserves. We wouldn't intend to pay it from financing. And at a later date, potentially, Montecito would participate, likely outside of the 3-year rate window. So in terms of the revenue requirement impact, we would have a significant cash outflow up front, and that's something we need to take on. It would likely require the use of reserves that we've built up. Potentially, then we would build those reserves back up over time, and when Montecito participates in that, we would be reimbursed. But that's something to consider. Of course, on the flip side of that, Mr. Hagmark, did you want to jump in there?
We had, we've kind of earmarked the grant that we got, the $10 million grant, as being a big chunk of bringing this down. And then just a reminder, right now where the negotiations ended is that they would be participating at 65% of these costs once we do expand in the future. So that's a little more background on that. And I think turn it back over to Mr. Hamilton to kind of explain then how the revenue side works to that.
Right. So there are benefits as well that would occur actually within this rate study. So at the commencement of water deliveries, Montecito's annual payments estimated now would be approximately $3.5 million annually to the city. So that would buffer a little bit the grant use. The $3.5 million would buffer some of those impacts up front, the $20 million. This is largely this is probably the main driving factor on the schedule, and we'll talk about that, but we're looking at a public hearing rate adoption in the September-October timeframe. Typically, we finalize rates in March and April. That is the estimated time frame for executing a water supply agreement right now. So at the exact moment we would normally be finalizing is when we'll get our concrete information from this, so we push back the rate adoption at this time. We do have some proposed staffing changes working internally right now, and these are related to getting out ahead of this new AMI implementation and some of the changing roles within Water Resources Division, and also some staffing support for the desal plant operations and administration of that operating agreement. However, that could bump up our kind of baseline salary and benefit level that we have right now and maybe step up a little bit and continue into the future. As always, we have capital infrastructure needs. We have our regular capital improvement program, our CIP program, but also the water distribution program is working on a strategic infrastructure plan that I believe will look out approximately 20 years. I should say this likely won't impact our 3-year rate schedule, but it could very well impact our 5 to 10-year financial plan. So another portion of this scope of work that HDR is working on is a 10-year financial plan. And for us, that's really about getting the trajectory of rate increases correct so that we're meeting these future needs. And so that becomes really, I think, important in the 5 to 10 year, but it may not actually factor into the kind of this short-term 3-year schedule. And then community choice energy, council is moving forward with the ability to determine our source of energy, and that will help the city meet the renewable goals that they've set for the city. Of course, for the revenue requirement in terms of water, we do have some cost associated with that. Early estimates, I should say these are kind of preliminary, but we are planning for them in the financial plan, is approximately $250,000 annually in administrative costs, and about a 10 to 12% step up in our electric costs, so that's about $300,000 annually.
Yeah, this is just to the water fund. There's also mirrored impacts to the wastewater fund that are approaching about $1 million associated with this.
Madam Chair, could you just expand a little bit about the annual administrative costs? I'm just curious as to.
Be happy to. So one of the challenges of getting the CCE off of the ground has been kind of setting up this infrastructure, this the staffing to support it, but then also to build up a reserve, depending on how many customers participate. And right now, without a formal CCE in place, the city is looking internally to all the electrical use within the city as a basis of getting that initial funding started. There is discussions at least taking place about once the CCE is approved, that any costs, additional costs that are contributed by the internal enterprises would be reimbursed by ratepayers as that gets up and gets moving. But initially, to get this off the ground, since Water Resources is the largest city facility user, we're picking up a big chunk of those costs.
Thank you for that, because that's how I understood that it worked. It wasn't an ongoing administrative cost, but it was the startup cost, which you may get reimbursed for. So if you went out 5 years or 10 years, you're not going to have that as ongoing startup costs.
We hope. I don't know that the final decision's been made, but that's
Again,
I'm hoping,
just
yeah.
our knowledge of other CCEs,
Right.
It is the upfront cost, which you hopefully get reimbursed by ratepayers. Thank you for the explanation.
Absolutely.
And Chair Bernie, Commissioners, I do want to note that we're an industrial user, so our 10 to 12% increase is on the higher end. I think the residences would see something in the 4 to 6 range. So those are kind of the several variables we're working with and just determining how much we need for the next 3 years. We do have other policy areas that are built into the model as assumptions, of course, water supply and customer demand. One of these elements, the first, is how we treat the water supply in the model. Santa Barbara, as you all know, has a fairly unique water supply portfolio. We have a lot of sources, and from year to year, there's a good amount of variability from where we deliver. What the model does is use the long-term yields of each of these sources to smooth out these annual changes. We're going to recommend that we continue doing that. if we were not doing that, you may see some spikes up and down in the unit costs from year to year. And with this smoothing approach, I think the one thing we just need to be careful of is watching these and monitoring these actual supply costs. So if we're getting divergent from what the model is projecting in the smooth scenario and what's actually being delivered, that the cost of those supplies and treatment is different, we just want to make sure that that we're on track. A lot of the costs for the water operations are fixed, so we should be pretty good in that situation. But it is something that HDR will be looking at is how we treat the water portfolio.
A good example, this will be it is the next presentation we have on our annual water supply plan, where you actually see that we've got significantly more water out of Gibraltar than we had anticipated. And so in theory, that should shift costs around, and that's why I think the smoothing idea is really applicable to a community such as ours that has such a diverse water supply.
Right.
Just one other question, because you talked about, what did you call it? Stacking, the stacking issue in terms of how you basically meet the demand. And again, ahead of the UWMP, we'll make assumptions as to how that stacking will happen. Again, they're kind of on a similar path in terms of timing. I don't know, chicken and egg in terms of how those policy decisions would be made.
I think in the 3-year window that we're looking here, I think we've kind of cut that set, and I think that's that plan is kind of in place. I think obviously the enhanced urban water management will look at that longer range view, which at some point, if our water supply situation stabilizes, we may be looking at doing 5-year rates of some sort, and then that I think will play more into that long term.
Yeah, thank you. So that leads right into the next point, which is how are we going to deal with the customer demand projections? We've been working with Madaus consultants, who are specialists in projecting water demand and taking into numerous factors. I think what we're saying here in these couple bullet points is we know there's going to be some rebound. We believe there's going to be based on the last drought and other agencies. We were going to tend to be on the conservative side, so that is meaning assuming higher conservation, not being aggressive on that projection of water demand, because that can quickly get upside down on us and we can fall short of our revenue projections. In order to kind of look at these two together, HDR will be doing some sensitivity analysis. So we'll be holding water supply constant and moving water supply and demand at the same time, and vice versa, and making sure we have the field of outcomes kind of well understood. We've talked about this previously in the staff reports, but not in this much detail, is that we do have some rate structure considerations that we really would like Mr. Korn to look at, and primarily it's in the commercial class. So currently our structure on the rate is they pay a fixed monthly charge based on their meter size. For the volumetric structure, there's a tier 1 is their allotment, so it's a January through June average water use, basically an off-peak water use time. And then we have a tier 2 rate for commercial customers, which is discretionary. We're dealing with a couple issues on both sides. So we have ours that are administrative internally to the city. We're finding these January through June water use calculations are calculated automatically. Our billing system's somewhat limited in its ability to deal with the variability of each individual customer. So allotments are really individual allotments, and when you get into individuality in the rate structure, we do a lot of hands-on management, manual management, corrections, providing credits to customers, reviewing their accounts, making sure it's equitable compared to other businesses like themselves. Everyone's, of course, feels that they have a unique and special situation. We like to hear them out, but it is a lot of time involved with that. On the business side, I think there are they have their own concerns, which is the allotments are based on these off-peak periods, which may not be entirely correct for a seasonal type of town. When you have a lot of influx in the summer, you have a lot of seasonal businesses. And to the point that it's off-peak allotment, they also don't have a lot of opportunities to conserve as well. So conservation typically comes from slower sales or slower business activity, and of course you don't manage that way to conserve water. So making sure that we look at this and potentially consider a uniform rate structure. So it's the same price for each unit of water. There's not a tiered rate structure. We're going to ask HDR to look into this. We know already from, and please jump in, Mr. Corn, if you'd like, we know from other agencies there typically are some impacts to the low water users. So you have a uniform rate, the low water users are going to see an increase in their rate immediately as you average out the high and low water users. And so what is that impact going to be like? What's the actual impact in a dollar amount? Is it significant? Making sure we're mindful of that. And as always with rates, looking at opportunities to phase in. So maybe this is something we do over a 3-year period, or we set it up to do over a multi-rate study period to bring them into a uniform rate.
And we don't have any predisposed answer to this right now. I think what we're basically setting up is that we're going to look at this. I think we have obviously implemented this program in an effort for conservation. And I think the question is, I think it's a good time to step back and take a look at that. We went through a significant drought. We know that this customer class certainly did not, and we knew could not conserve like the residential customers could. And so to that end, did this program, was it really effective? Because it is a lot of administrative time and energy to manage it. Or is there a better way that we might manage this? And so we're going to study it, we're going to look at it, and we'll bring that back for more discussion.
So looking into the kind of the final area of the rate structure considerations is, some of you may be aware that in 2016, Council adopted priority allocations. And so really what does that mean? It means that the highest priority customers and tiers get the lowest cost water. And we are likely going to bring a recommendation. We think this works very well right now to continue to this process. But looking back at the commercial structure, right now the Tier 1 and Tier 2 for commercial have different priority allocations. And so when you combine those, where do you put them in the priority seating of customers, and how does that have kind of an added impact? We're not entirely sure. If you lower them on the priority scale, they could even get higher cost water. In addition to this uniform rate, you kind of have a double impact, and we want to be mindful of that as well. We in the past, and we talked about this a lot in water, is how do we collect our revenue? Is it through fixed monthly charges or metered water use, volumetric water use? Right now, the rate structure intends to collect about 30% of our revenue from fixed monthly charges based on your meter size, and 70% of our revenue comes through how much water are you using, so the volumetric charges. There is a inherent kind of revenue instability there because most of our costs are fixed costs. So when you cut back on water use, you don't cut back on a lot of our costs, but you drastically change our revenue very quickly. Conservation, and it provides a really good conservation signal to have it set at such a high volumetric, 70% volumetric charges. But looking, maybe we can potentially just move the dial slightly on this from a 30 to 35% fixed monthly charges, and looking at what kind of revenue stability that would provide. Of course, there are always considerations. So we know that some of our SRF opportunities, grant opportunities, are tied to specific best management practices, like a 30 to 70 split, and making sure that we're compliant with our current loans and setting ourselves up to be eligible for future grant opportunities, making sure we're not walking away from those. Like I said, revenue stability versus the incentives to conserve. So if you cut back on water, you can not only affect your water bill very drastically, but you can also affect your wastewater bill because we have up to a cap being billed there.
Sorry to have little minor questions. It just made me think, because I don't understand Prop 218 and how it deals with cycles, right? Because you have high cycles, and in fact, everybody's using a lot of water and you're getting a lot of money, but then you have these low troughs where you're not basically covering your costs. How does 218 basically average that out?
Let me take credit.
I'll let Mr. Corn go into the details on that one.
So ultimately, the basis for the rates comes back to what we establish as our reasonable costs of providing service. So that's where, when Malcolm was talking about how do we merge the overall supply costs and the demands, that's really what's going to drive that. So one of the things we'll look at as we go through this and establish that final revenue requirement or the cost we need is, what is that level of consumption? So if we model it at a drought, that unit cost and ultimately those rates go up because we have to collect it. And then the cost of service in Prop 218 says, okay, where do those costs go? Is it a fixed? Is it a variable, water supply essentially versus other fixed costs? So Prop 218, I don't think, and we could talk to legal to answer this more fully, but Prop 218 doesn't necessarily or specifically say anything about the impacts of drought. It's how we're establishing the rates to collect that revenue. And that's really the driver. So that's where when we look at this, we need to be somewhat conservative on our assumptions, because if we're low, revenues are lower, the city has to go through a whole nother Prop 218 requirement, right? And so it's ultimately coming back and saying, where do we draw that trend line in revenues and expenses? How is that looking to ultimately drive that cost? So in the short term, Prop 218, would it impact it? Long term, it does, in the sense of we're basing it on our actual costs and our actual demands as we go forward.
So if you just look at the past 10-year period, obviously in drought, if your trend line's down there, it's going to give you a different number than the
Correct.
50-year historical average. And in fact, when you then factor in the fact that we think that we're going to have more drought in the future, that'd be defensible under 218.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we just have to outline our assumptions and basis for our proposed rates, and it really comes down to reasonableness,
And,
which is
and
a
those
hard
could
term.
be challenged then legally? Theoretically.
Theoretically, yes, anything could be
you don't
challenged.
have to answer, Dan. That was more
Let's,
more a
Mr. Henschke.
that was a more of a rhetorical statement than it was a question.
Honorable Chair, members of the Commission. I think what Mr. Corm said is really the legal construct within which you have to work. Prop 218 doesn't establish any particular kind of rate methodology or any kind of particular rate structure. It allows the rate-setting agency discretion to use its legislative judgment to determine whether or not a particular structure is good or bad, or appropriate for the community and consistent with the law. One of the things I think that Mr. Corm was hitting on earlier was you do have things like reserves, and part of your total cost revenue requirement are reserves and other methodologies for dealing with the ups and downs of a long-term projection. All rate setting, like all water use and all water supply, has to be based upon reasonable assumptions about what's going to happen in the future. And unless you have the ability as a legislative body to predict accurately 100% of the time the future, you will always have these fluctuations. The courts recognize this, and they recognize that the purpose of 218 is to correlate the customer usage, as Mr. Corm talked about, with the revenue requirements, so to make sure that it's reasonable and fair, so that one customer class, or essentially as they say in the Constitution, one parcel, is not paying more than its fair share of the costs based upon the services and service needs attributable to that parcel. Do we do this on a parcel by parcel basis? No, that's not reasonable. We do it on a customer class basis, and that correlates back to the impacts on the parcel. But in answer to your question, those are projections over time that you factor into your overall revenue requirement.
Good. Thank you for the answer. Thanks a lot.
Also, if I may add, Commissioner Davis, if you remember, we were doing annual rate adjustments. So you get into a highly volatile period, you're probably closing down your rate schedule period to be able to adjust annually to fluctuations and large fluctuations. We're coming out into a little more certainty period, so we're looking at 3 years. Some agencies do 5 and they feel really comfortable with that. We're probably not at that point yet. Just a couple more slides. So quickly, I want to touch on this because this is part of the scope of work for HDR, is that we're going to work through our rate study, our 3-year schedule, bring that to Water Commission and City Council, like I said, a public hearing in September, October. After that point, we've contracted with HDR to do a preliminary review of water bill, water rate, all sorts of names are out there, but an assistance program and how people are funding those, how they're administering them, what the agencies what the agencies set themselves up like to be successful, who's eligible, what's the criteria for being eligible, and those type of considerations. We're moving in that direction, but we don't believe we can complete this at the same time that we can do the rate study. So we'll set this and we'll take this on after we've got rate sets. Oftentimes, especially in California, it's identifying the revenue source. So what type of non-rate revenues are available to fund these type of programs? For us, it's typically pretty limited. And oftentimes we take those non-rate revenues and we buy down the revenue requirement, meaning we need less rate revenue than we would otherwise. So taking a look at that.
So we anticipate if we do find something, it would probably be implemented during the next 3-year rate study, if that's what we're looking at. Just want to make sure we set expectations. I think it's a good dialogue. I think it's something we need to be looking at, but it's likely to have some significant impacts, and certainly not something we figured we could roll into this year's.
So we'll take any input you've had. We've got some good questions so far, and we'll be moving into kind of our preliminary technical and draft water rate technical analysis with HDR. We plan hopefully to have a meeting with the Water Commission Ad Hoc Committee. It was Commissioner Burney, Commissioner Keller on that in January, looking at some of our early findings. Bringing some final policy and rate structure recommendations to Water Commission in February. That's our tentative plan at this time. And of course, then finalizing the rate schedule, the proposed rates, getting the notice prepared, and ultimately culminating in a public hearing in September, October timeframe of this year. That's our presentation for today. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
So shush me if I shouldn't be looking for an answer to this question, but so you indicated you're going to push this out a little bit, waiting for the Montecito Water District dynamics. If that falls through, we still want that pipeline for our purposes too, right? That's our method of conveying desal to the top half of the city.
Commissioner Jordan, at this point, it does not rise to the level of a priority for us if we're by ourselves on that. I'm certainly going to take a look at where we fit that in, but we currently have a method of delivering the current production from the desal plant without that pipeline.
Okay, and obviously that's predicated on water supply from other places then, right? Can get there to
Yes.
the top half of the city.
Right.
If that changed, then
Right.
it would become a different priority. And then, so if you did the pipeline, that's 20 million, and I would assume you have some other projects that would potentially meet to the threshold of the project labor agreement that's being worked on. So all that goes into the factoring, or that will play in that time period on the increased costs that could happen there?
Yes, I don't know that we've fed in the PLA into that current cost. I think it's it hits projects over 5 million.
And an undefined percentage.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we already get a lot of local labor working on all the water resources projects we have. I have no reason to believe we won't in the future, but it could have an impact.
And then my other questions are really just a list of how you build your revenue requirements and what you're contemplating. And I'll just go quickly through these, and you can decide what you want to talk about. But that's if you're going to add 3 of them have to do with resiliency, and so that's if you're planning on including revenue requirements for another unit on desal, for better electrical backup for our locally controlled water sources, whether that's desal or groundwater pumping, and also whether we're pricing to encourage full recovery of our groundwater basins rather than using them at all. So those 3 have to do kind of with my idea of resiliency, and the other 2 are increasing water main replacement schedules and increasing the infrastructure needed for added recycled water supply to customers. So that's my kind of kitchen sink worth of, do all those fall into revenue requirements considerations for this project, for this process?
Commissioner Jordan, yes, and a lot of them have been incorporated. As you recall, we doubled the main replacement program. We're now replacing 2%, which is, amongst other agencies, is a pretty aggressive program, but that reflects kind of the age of our infrastructure. We're an older community, and so we have more aging pipes that we need to deal with. But that's incorporated currently. We've also prepared for AMI, so we've got a rate structure to support the initial deployment of AMI going forward. And then as far as management of the groundwater basin, I think some of that stuff is going to come out of the Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. We certainly are looking for groundwater injection, but I don't anticipate there'll be significant costs associated with that. As we've been replacing wells, we have built wells that will allow for us to do injection. So I'm not anticipating significant costs from that. Is there what else did I?
Desal?
Desal at this point.
Or not,
At this point, as we mentioned at the last meeting, we don't have plans in the next 3 years to do any expansions to desal, so we don't have any program costs in there for that. Staff, I think if they're not done with it now, they should be done with it. We have implemented all of the public safety power shutoffs so that the city's water system is robust enough to handle a multi-day outage. We've got all of our critical facilities backed up, aside from desal. But again, that speaks to our diverse water supply. We're able to take that offline for periods of time, such as those power outages. So I think we've made those investments. So I think that has already been incorporated into the current rates.
Okay.
Mr.
Thanks.
Hagmark, as well, we've been managing the water fund very prudently, so we have cap space in our debt service coverage ratio to take on debt, although we'd like to not to, but there is an opportunity there if we had to fund one of these larger capital projects, and we'd still be able to meet all of our debt requirements as well.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions? Councilmember Sen.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a couple quick questions. One is sea level rise. I know we're talking 3-year plan, 10-year plan. At what point do we start building that in, and would it come out of ratepayers or different areas? So just, I guess, a comment that it's not on the list of considerations, and maybe it should be part of the considerations.
Chair Bernie, council members, and a great question. And I don't anticipate in this round of rate, looking at the rates, that we will have anything in here for sea level rise or climate change to that end. And I think we certainly will be looking at that with our Enhanced Urban Water Management Plan. We'll be looking at that. I really think the way that this is unfolding as a community, as we start to look at what is going to be our plan to deal with sea level rise, I'm really thinking this that plan is going to be coming together somewhere in the 2024, 2025 range. So may have some component in the next rate study, may not, but it's certainly on our radar. I don't think we have any, we haven't developed yet what those implementations are going to look like initially. I think it's, as far as climate change, we've been dealing with the current drought, and we know that's been expensive. But I think switching to also what does sea level rise mean, not only for water, but the wastewater fund as well.
Thank you. I know it's on your radar and you're making long-term plans, but just at what stages that those come in. So the long-term water plan is where we'll start bringing that to the Water Commission. Okay.
Yes.
And then that just as a comment, it has always bothered me that we incentivize water use, and that's how we get our revenue, that when people are conserving too much, we're losing too much revenue to keep going. And I think that's an important part of the reconsideration of the rate structure, that when you're saying most of the costs are fixed costs, that I feel like that needs to be in the billing process. And I know it's a fuller discussion than that, but it is problematic that when people are conserving too much, we're losing too much revenue in that.
It is a very difficult, and we're not the only utility. SCE faces the same. The Public Utility Commission faces the same thing. When 80 to 85% of our costs are fixed, really not doesn't matter how much water people use. But then on the other end, we are trying to head off these major costs. If that was the scenario and people got this flat bill and there really wasn't any incentive to not conserve, it's really difficult. So our rate structure almost represents the opposite of what our actual costs are. And so it's a very difficult message. And I think that's one that the Water Commission was challenged with during the drought, was communicating that. Well, if that's the cost of service, if the cost water use goes down, then shouldn't the cost of everything goes down? And unfortunately, if it was structured differently, yes. But I think at the end, we do want to recognize and reward conservation. And if we truly structured it how our costs come in, there would be very little reward or incentive for people to use less.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And then one more just question. How much of Measure C, or if any, can be used for infrastructure issues that might offset some of the rate requirements?
None. I don't believe that's how it was tabled as an infrastructure, but it was never anticipated that it would ever be used for anything water related. And to that point, I'm glad you brought that up, because that is an element. And again, we didn't want to get too much into the weeds, but having this Measure C now, it's been great for street maintenance program has really taken off. But out of that program, what has become is there's a different practice for working in the street, utility maintenance in the street, and as a result, our utility costs for working in the street has gone up significantly. Instead of paving a 4-foot strip, they're looking for us to pave an entire traffic lane, which has driven up our water main replacement cost by about 7%. And we have yet to figure out how to do that except to reduce the amount of pipe we're doing. So it could be something that we try to address during this rate update. But I think that's another challenge that we're working with. We're trying to be good users of the right-of-way and what is reasonable in the way of paving and maintenance of that street right-of-way.
So I might encourage that, looking into how Measure C can help with the paving. And I have to say that the accelerated rate that the water mains are being replaced and streets also accelerated rate at which they're being improved, and it looks beautiful when it's done, and some, and all the pipes are done, but that's expensive. Mm-hmm. And so if just that consideration of that as that's being accelerated and you're working on those streets, that maybe Measure C might be able for the street part.
We are working on that. Our acting water system manager, Matt Ward, has really dived into, and again, we have a 100-year main replacement mixed with a 7-year street maintenance program. So they're two very different cycles, but he's really been trying to identify those overlays. And in particular, if we can replace the main and streets is already going to do the paving, it could be could at least offset some of the other costs for paving on our other locations, if that can be handled that way. So we're looking for those opportunities. The difficult part is that puts us in someone's front yard longer to do that. So if we cutting up the street, we're there for 2 weeks, cutting it open, and then the paving comes in and they're there for another week. So trying to find that sweet balance, because some people are like, okay, I'm okay with a couple of days. Now you seem like you're going to be here forever. So trying to match that, because I think you're right. When we're done, nice new street, nice new utilities underneath, everyone's happy, but it was, want to make sure we don't lose them during construction on that. Mm-hmm.
All right. Not seeing any other questions. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for the presentation, and we look forward to hearing from you again in February. We will proceed to item C, Annual Water Supply Management Report. Ms. Corey.
Well, Ms. Corey makes her way up here and her presentation going. Just wanted to set the stage that this presentation is slightly different than what we're going to give to council, because we were here last month and gave kind of the water supply plan going out. This is the backwards document that we're required to do annually. And so Ms. Corey has done wonderful job of trying to incorporate a little bit, but the presentation to council that we'll do on January 28th will kind of be a melding of those two presentations. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Gordon.
Presentation. Thank you. I apologize. In this presentation, I'm going to do a really brief update or a recap of that water supply update. Make sure that there is room for any questions that you might have since I was here in November. And then we'll really dig into the annual water supply management report itself. We'll talk a little bit about the purpose of the report. And then I'm really going to focus on our groundwater findings. One of the requirements of the report is that we make the finding that our groundwater basins are in long-term balance. So that's where we're headed today. So again, a recap of our water supply planning update that was given in more detail in November. You did see this graphic last month. This is our 2019 planned water supply portfolio versus how we actually used our water supplies. And the big takeaway here was that Gibraltar filled and spilled, and we were able to use much more Gibraltar water than we had originally planned for. And by doing so, that allowed us to use less state water and to store a whole bunch of water in Kachuma. So we've got over 20,000 acre feet of water stored in Lake Kachuma right now. We also used less groundwater than we had planned. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper to the demand side of our water use in 2019. You've also seen this graphic before. It is updated with November 2019 data. The blue line represents our target water use for each month, and the red line represents our actual water use. The gray hashed line up top is the 2013 actual water use. And you'll see that we've been tracking pretty consistently at a 30% 12-month running average conservation compared to 2013. For the month of November, we saw a 20% reduction in water use compared to 2013. And just like we looked at last month, I just want to focus your attention on the two data points for October 2019 and November 2019 on the right-hand side of the graphic. You can see that we're right on target there. Our actual and our target are lining up nicely. And for both of those months, we've seen 20% conservation. So what that means is moving forward, I've actually adjusted our target to expect 20% conservation versus the 30% that we've seen in the previous water year. And I wanted, again, to dive a little bit deeper in how our customers used water in 2019. This pie chart represents our water usage by our different customer classes, and you can see by far our biggest users of our water supply are our residential customers, making up over 65% of our total water use. Then we have commercial use at around 20%. Our dedicated irrigation customers use about 5% of our total water use, and 7% is recycled water. Digging a little bit deeper into what that looks like in terms of conservation, let's focus first on the left-hand side of this slide, the text. What I looked at here was how much did each of our different customer classes conserve. And so I compared 2019 water usage to 2013 water usage. And you can see that our largest conservation came from our single-family residential customers and our dedicated irrigation customers. And this is exactly what we'd expect. Landscape is our biggest opportunity for conservation in the city. And so the single-family residential customers, a significant portion of their usage typically is applied to landscape. And then obviously that dedicated irrigation customers, all that is landscape. And so that's where we saw our biggest ability to conserve. Our multifamily residential, commercial and industrial, and recycled water customers all were conserving in that 17 to 18%. The graphic on the right looks at conservation from a little bit different perspective. It's a pie chart, and the pie represents the total volume of water that was conserved if you compare 2019 to 2013. And so again, you can see our residential customers in general provided the biggest volume of water conserved in that time period, with well over 70% conservation. Our commercial industrial customers weren't able to conserve as much in that volume. So again, we're talking piece of the pie, so it's a volume, as were our irrigation or recycled water customers. And some of that is just because we have a lot more residential customers than we do our other customer classes. And then also things like with the commercial customers, we're talking bottom line, and they're probably running their businesses pretty efficiently anyways. And so their opportunity to conserve is typically less in a drought. Yeah.
Thank you. I think you've emphasized that the percentages are amount of volume. So does that mean that of the total amount of water conserved, 62% of that is from single-family residential?
Exactly. Yeah, that's
Okay.
exactly what the graph represents.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so then I'm going to jump topics a little bit here, again, because we're just kind of summarizing where we were last month. All of these topics, though, are included in our annual water supply management report. And like Mr. Hagmark said earlier, we'll be combining this as one comprehensive presentation to council in January. So some of the key supply planning issues we see with our various supplies, several revolve around the Kachuma project. And as you know, we just recently had the State Water Resources Control Board adopt our new state water rights order on the Kachuma project. We're expecting the biological opinion on the Kachuma project in the next couple of years. And also our water supply agreement on Kachuma, the Kachuma contract, should be renegotiated in the 2020 timeframe. So those are all different issues that affect that supply for us. And then also the State Water Project has a bunch of issues related to that source. And so we've talked in here about Delta Conveyance. We've also talked about the contract assignment or reassignment between the county and CCWA. And finally, it's an ongoing discussion about potential places where we can store some of our state water so that we potentially lose less should San Luis Reservoir spill or from evaporation. And then lastly, I brought a quick update last month about our enhanced urban water management plan, which will be our planning document looking forward on how we'll be using our water supplies in the future. I did just receive 2 proposals from various vendors on that plan, and we're going to start the review process. So we anticipate interviews in early January, and then we hope to be able to kick off the planning project in early March. So finally, these were the conclusions that we drew from the supply planning experience last month. We did determine that the city has sufficient supplies to meet demands through water year 2022, and that doesn't require desal expansion or supplemental water purchases. Basically, we have quite a bit of water sitting in Kachuma right now, which really helps us cover our demands in the next several years. We also have sufficient excess supplies to meet our demands of the water supply agreement with Montecito Water District, should it be ratified. And then finally, staff believes that the stage 1 water supply condition remains appropriate as we head into this next rainy season. We'll see what happens in terms of rainfall this winter, and then we can revisit that in spring of 2020. So now I want to take a breath and pause and see if any of you have questions on any of those issues. They are all covered in the annual water supply management report. You might have some questions there. And then after that, we'll dive deeper into the groundwater and the findings that we were able to make in the report there.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Davis?
Actually, it's groundwater, so
Okay.
wait.
Okay.
Any questions on this? Yep.
So the potential water for Montecito Water District, if that didn't go through, that would be like excess. And then you'd go through a process of determining probably whether to increase the level of production at desal versus use a different water source based on price. Is that how that would go?
Yeah, we look at price and availability. So typically the water supplies that we'd be potentially not using would be groundwater because we want to continue to rest our basins. State water is typically more costly. Desal can be costly to produce. So those are the sources that we'd be looking at.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, let's move on to the annual water supply management report itself. And again, I'm really going to focus on the groundwater component since we've talked about a lot of the other topics in the report in the past. So, diving right in, the purpose of the report is it's a backwards looking document. So, at the end of the water year in September 2019, we look back at the year and we say, how did we use our sources? What were the various issues we encountered? What's kind of the status of each of our sources moving forward? It is a requirement of our state water usage coming out of the EIR for that project. And each year we need to be able to make a finding that our groundwater basins are in long-term balance in accordance with our long-term water supply plan policy. So to summarize our groundwater usage and policy, groundwater is conjunctively used at the city, and what that means is in times of drought, we pump more groundwater when surface water and other supplies are less available. And then in wet years, we rest our groundwater basins and let them recover so that they're available the next time that they're needed. Groundwater is also an emergency supply for the city, so if something were to happen to Tecolote Tunnel or Mission Tunnel, which bring water down from Kachuma and Gibraltar Reservoir, that's a local supply that we have control over, and we could turn on our wells and provide emergency water services as needed. This map is a map of our groundwater basins. I apologize up front that it is not particularly PowerPoint friendly, but I'm going to try to navigate us through it a little bit so that you can see what's going on. The black dotted line represents the boundaries to each of our groundwater basins. The red line is our city boundary. And then if we focus, yeah, you might be able to use the pointer a little bit. If we focus here in the middle of the slide, you can see the text that says storage unit number 1. So storage unit number 1 is our largest groundwater basin, and you can see the small squares down below that text. Those represent our production wells within storage unit number 1. And the text there names each of them. I'm happy to tell you what those names are if you're curious about one of them, but for now, just know that there are production wells. If we move up to the upper left-hand corner of this map, that shows our Foothill Groundwater Basin. It basically underlies Mission Canyon and like Upper State Street, San Roque area. We do have 3 production wells in our Foothill Groundwater Basin, and we're not the only pumper there. La Cumbre Mutual Water District is also a pretty big pumper, up to 300 acre-feet per year. And then finally, in the lower left-hand corner of this map, we have our storage unit number 3. I'll talk about it a little bit more in the future, but it has fairly poor water quality, so it's not a potable water source for us, but we do have a well that allows us to supplement the recycled water system with this water if needed. So diving into the Foothill Basin, as I mentioned a minute ago, there are several pumpers in the basin, with another big pumper being La Cumbre Mutual Water District. We completed a modeling study with the U.S. Geological Society in 2018 to look at our multi-year drought yield for each of our water basins, and they determined that our multi-year drought yield in Foothill is 8,130 acre-feet. In 2019, we didn't produce any water out of the Foothill Basin. We are trying to rest that basin and let it recover after the drought. We do estimate, though, that we have approximately 3,800 acre-feet still in the basin available to us should we need it. Currently, water levels in the Foothill Basin are at about early 90 levels, and so you can remember that the early 90s is when we came out of our last drought, and our levels are kind of right back in there. And that drought, it took about 5 years for those water levels to recover, so we're expecting something similar this time if we can rest our basins that long. Storage unit number 1 is our largest groundwater basin. It underlies most of downtown Santa Barbara. We do have several production wells in storage unit number 1. That same 2018 study with USGS determined that our multi-year drought yield is approximately 16,090 acre-feet. We did pump a little bit of water out of storage unit number 1 in 2019, 318 acre-feet. That was mainly to help with some peak demands in the summer. And we actually also have to just exercise and maintain our wells, and we might as well put that water into the system when we're doing that rather than send it out if we have to. We do have quite a bit of estimated remaining yield in the Foothill Basin, 10,300 acre-feet. The issue with storage unit 1 is that it rebounds pretty quickly in terms of water level. We actually have some wells right now that are artesianing, so the water levels are pretty high in storage unit 1. The tricky part with storage unit 1 is if you look at the map in the lower right-hand corner, that red city boundary, that's the Pacific Ocean. And so when we pump our wells in storage unit number 1, we can pull some of that seawater into the basin. It's connected to the ocean, and we can see seawater intrusion. So when we do use this groundwater basin more heavily like we did in the drought, we have to monitor for seawater intrusion, and I'm going to dive into that a little bit deeper in the next few slides. We do point out that the top 2 squares you see are Alameda and High School well. Pumping those wells versus the ones that are closer to the shoreline typically doesn't draw in as much seawater and can help with fight against seawater intrusion. Okay, so this is a map that's going to help us orient us as we explore seawater intrusion in the storage unit number 1. You'll see the 3 red arrows. The lowest arrow is, well, let me first tell you that the yellow dots represent monitoring wells. We have monitoring wells throughout all of our groundwater basins, and we can monitor both groundwater level and water quality. So specifically in relation to seawater intrusion, we're looking at chloride levels. And so the monitoring well, the lowest red arrow, is closest to the ocean, and then we can move inwards. The next one is located near El Estero, so about halfway between the ocean and the 101. And then we look at one further up that's just on the inland side of the 101. And then you can probably see, I'll see if I can use the arrow of the mouse, these little black triangles right up here. Those are our production wells. And so the idea is as seawater moves inland, the closer it gets to our production wells, the more concerned we are. And so this is going to explore where seawater is at these 3 different monitoring wells. So starting with the monitoring well located closest to the ocean, this is our 23F4 monitoring well. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, you'll see at the end of the last drought, so over here on the left-hand side of the drought, this is the late 80s, early 90s, we had some seawater intrusion, and our chloride levels were up in the 11,000 to 14,000 milligrams per liter concentration level. And then you can see right about from 1995 to 2000, we see our chloride levels dropping. That's the recovery coming out of the drought. And then they hover right around 6,000 milligrams per liter until 2014 when we start pumping again and they start going back up. So at this monitoring well located closest to the ocean, we do see pretty significant jumps in seawater or in chloride levels as we pump the basin. We would expect this one to recover when it drops back down to that 6,000 milligrams per liter mark, which we think, again, would take about 5 years based on the last drought. So moving inland, we're now at our 23E5 monitoring well. And I do want to point out in these graphs of chloride, the y-axis is the same for each graph because I want to show you the relative concentration of chlorides as we move inland. So it makes the data kind of squishy at the bottom, but I want to show you that chloride levels are less as we move inland. So again, same pattern. In the early 1990s, we saw chloride levels hovering in the 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams per liter level. That was some seawater intrusion. It took about 5 years for those to drop back down. A recovered level is in the range of 50 to 200 milligrams per liter at this monitoring well, and we hovered in that range for quite a while until 2014 when we started pumping the basin again, and we saw those chloride levels rise. They didn't go as high as they did in the last drought. We're right under 1,400 milligrams per liter right now. So again, recovery take about 5 years, and we would start to see them drop back down into that 50 to 200 milligrams per
You're
liter
going to run through every one of these, but what number is no longer usable or treatable for chloride levels?
I think we'd want to see, and we have Miss Fair is somewhere around here, but I think it's somewhere around 300 milligrams per liter would be something that we could utilize.
And finally, the last monitoring well, so now we've hopped over the 101 freeway. We're inland of the ocean, and you can see that there's actually no effective seawater intrusion at this well. So you can see all the way from the late 80s through present day, we've maintained a consistent level of chlorides. It ranges from like 25 to 55, 60 milligrams per liter. And this is one of the wells that we kind of consider our canary in the coal mine, if you will. So you can see that we're getting much closer to those black triangles that represent our production wells. So we know that the seawater intrusion has not been pulled in that far, and that's a good thing. So jumping out of storage unit number 1, we'll look quickly at storage unit number 3. You'll remember this was the basin in the lower left-hand corner of our groundwater map. This storage unit number 3 does have difficult water quality, so we don't use it for potable water production. There are some other pumpers in the basin. We've estimated the safe yield from this basin to the city to be about 200 acre-feet per year. We didn't produce any water out of storage unit number 3 last year. And as I mentioned before, because of the water quality, this is a great basin to use to supplement our recycled water system as needed, but we don't use it for the potable system. So now we're jumping right ahead to the recommendation that we'll have council hopefully approve in January, and this comes directly out of the annual water supply management report. So we're asking them to approve the report for the 2019 water year and then make the finding that our groundwater resources are in long-term balance in accordance with our long-term water supply planning policy. And that also concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Davis.
Thank you. Actually, you answered 3/4 of my questions in that regard. I want to thank you for the graph on the seawater intrusion stuff. That's really informative and something which I've been curious about, and my questions to a large degree went around that in terms of rate of recovery, et cetera, et cetera. So you answered all of those particular questions. The question I have goes back to Councilmember Snedden's question on the sea level rise. We both sit on that committee. And I'll give you a briefing as to where we're at, but we got these draft recommendations for immediate actions. And one of the things in the near-term plan they have in there, which it just struck me wrong, was lowering the groundwater, pumping out groundwater in order to compensate for what's happening with increase of the sea level rise. And it seemed inconsistent with the whole question of seawater intrusion and the management of our wells. And we're coming back to a meeting in January before it gets released publicly. And I'm just curious as to, because I'm sure you must have seen that. If you haven't, initial comments that you might have, which might help inform us as we go into our meeting in January.
Yes, a great question, Commissioner Davis, and I'd love to clear this up. So the data that we are collecting are from a defined aquifer that is not that shallow groundwater that I'm presuming the commission is talking about, or committee is talking about, related to initial sea level rise impacts. This is a basin much lower, and so it's kind of a totally different scenario. We actually a pressurized situation that's already occurring in this aquifer that we're pulling from. We do not have any wells in that shallow aquifer, and I think what the committee may be looking at is whether you can buy yourself some more time by pumping down that shallow aquifer. The challenge that you will face, because I've done enough construction down there, is contamination. That whole lower part of the city has had some just bad behavior in the past, and pumping that water out will likely require significant treatment before disposal.
And again, you're a geologist. I'm assuming then the difference within those water basins, the shallow one is where they're talking about pumping out to compensate for flooding. Right. It's a mitigation for flooding, and that the geologic structure is such that there is no impact then upon the lower strata.
That is correct.
Okay. Thank you. That helps a great deal. Thank you.
Yeah, there was a clarification I wanted to add to that the groundwater basins that we produce our water from have a clay cap, essentially. So there's really, in our modeling efforts, there was really thought to be no interaction between that
no
upper
migration at all
zone and the water producing zones.
It was really helpful during that modeling study. I mean, even with our wells that we have, we actually pour a concrete seal to seal off this top groundwater from those two lower aquifers that we actually pull from. But what we've also found from that study is if water does not get in to the aquifer, if water doesn't get into the ground above Oak Park, it has really no benefits to us from a water supply perspective. Now, there are probably water quality benefits to still having rain gardens and other things below Oak Park, but it doesn't have a water supply benefit.
Thank you so much. That's really, really helpful for us.
Other questions? Yeah.
One quick question that was very, very helpful clarification. So for the deeper aquifer, it's a 5-year recharge rate. Is that what historically?
I mean, we're just looking then at how it played out last time, and again, it really reflects on what kind of rain patterns we get following that will determine that. But I think it's an indicator anyway that we can bring back and report out on the health of that basin.
Thank you.
So I had the same kind of question. When are you saying that 5-year starts? Are you assuming it has started already, or is it still just when it clearly starts, that's the amount of time we need?
I would say we started it when we began resting our basins, which was about a year ago. We haven't pumped anything out of Foothill for over a year, and we pumped very little out of storage unit
Actually
1.
seen, I noticed we lost the little squiggly chart in our thing that we couldn't read usually for your report, but are we actually seeing higher levels of groundwater in those basins in Foothill or number 1?
Yes, they're starting to creep back up.
Okay. And then on a couple of the slides where you're showing water amounts, you use the phrase multi-year yield. And how many years is a multi-year yield? And then versus the available yield that's available. And is the available yield an annual amount, or how do those two numbers relate to each other?
That's a very good question. I can't confirm the definition of multi-year off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look at the report. I believe it was a 10-year drought period, but I'm not feeling 100% certain about that answer. In terms of the remaining, what we do is we take that multi-year yield. So, for example, it was over 16,000 acre-feet for storage unit number 1, and we subtract out everything that we've used since the start of the drought, since we started pumping the basins, and what's left over is our remaining yield. So it's not necessarily an annual amount, it's a total volume that we have available to us.
Cataclysmic amount to use right now, right?
Sure.
Okay. And then I just have a suggestion on page 5 of the council agenda report. The last paragraph in there talks about 1950s and 1960s levels. One of the things that always impresses me there, because people just kind of scoff at that, is you actually throw we've used this number before on what the population of the city was then, because it's like 40,000 more people, and we're using less than what was here
in the 50s and 60s.
In the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
And that always seems like an advance point to development and growth, that we're actually doing way better per piece of development than we were in the 1950s and 60s. So if you want to, my suggestion is you find that number and just throw it in there.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Just one little follow-up. On page 11 of the report, you talk about the Kachuma contract. And you talk about the fact that it's going to expire September 2020. And it's going to take several years to complete any kind of new or renewal. I'm assuming, and we didn't say it, that what is the status of extension of that?
Well, that's a great question, and that if we're done, that kind of leads us to our next, the CCWA, CCRB. We were just going to touch on that really quickly because there hasn't been any progress on that. And so, yeah. I don't know if you want to. I can take a stab at it right now, or we can.
No, we'll wait. I'll wait. Thanks.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I'm looking for a recommendation
Move staff recommendation.
and a second.
I'll second.
Thank you very much. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Okay, next we'll move on to an introduction to, I'm just going to use the acronym, PFAS substances. Galen Fair, you're up.
Chair, commissioners, this is an item I wanted to bring forward to you because there's a lot of conversation in the community about PFASs. I will start off because Ms. Fair is going to scare you. I'm going to start off by saying we do not have a problem here, and she will quantify that at the end of her presentation. But there's a lot of discussion about what PFASs are, and they seem to be prolific, unfortunately, in our community, showing up on all kinds of different stuff. But we do not have a problem in our water supply. Having said that,
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Galen Fair. I am the laboratory supervisor. And I will touch today on poly or perfluoroalkyl substances, more commonly known as PFAS. So we'll go over a quick background history, what some of the health effects are, timeline as far as regulations and limits that have been imposed, what the city has done for PFAS testing, and what we can do to reduce exposure. So I will apologize ahead of time. This is a pretty technical topic, so if I start to get too technical, throw something at me.
no, we'll try to keep it moving. We thought this would be a good way to put some information together. I know you can find a lot of information out there. Some trust their local government, some trust other sources. We thought we would make this available on our site so that people can come here. So there's a lot of detail here, and we'll try to keep it moving.
Yes. So what are PFAS? They are per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. You can see the chemical structure. The chemistry nerd in me gets really excited about this. And one thing to point out is, and I'm going to start using the acronyms because it's just less of a tongue twister. PFOA and PFOS are two of the most studied PFAS chemicals. So a lot of the regulations that we'll touch on are very specific to these two chemicals, but they are also included in the larger PFAS group. There are over 3,000 PFAS chemicals that have been manufactured. They have been dubbed the forever chemical because they don't break down easily. The other FC is again, the chemistry nerd in me, sorry. Fluorine carbon bond is one of the strongest in organic chemistry, so that's why it doesn't break down so easily. So a little bit of history. They've been manufactured since the 1940s. They were originally manufactured to enhance everyday products to resist heat, oil, grease, stains, water. One of the most common you are probably all aware of is Teflon. But as you can see over time, that pan, it will break down. So PFAS are used in a wide variety of applications, both industrial and residential. So we'll just go over where we can find them. They're typically used in fire retardants, oil and water repellents, furniture, waterproof clothes, takeout containers, nonstick cookware. So they're very prevalent. They're in everyday life. And it's one of those things that, yes, we are exposed to them, but it's part of everyday life. I mean, we can't really get away from it at this point. One of the big things in the news these days has been drinking water sources that have been contaminated. So drinking water can be a source if the water supply is contaminated. And that's where there's a movie that just came out, I won't promote it, but talks about it. DuPont and 3M were some of the larger manufacturers of this that have contaminated some of the water supplies in the Midwest, which has led to a big issue because of some of the health effects. So we'll touch on the health effects. PFAS are introduced into the body by eating or drinking food contaminated or water contaminated with PFAS. You can ingest it by breathing in or touching products treated with PFAS. And then the very interesting thing about the PFAS chemicals is they bioaccumulate. So over time, as you're exposed to it, it builds up and builds up and builds up. And since it doesn't break down so easily, that buildup just gets higher and higher. So there's a fun little pictogram there showing how you can get it, where it comes from, and like I said, it's pretty much in everything. Scientists have found PFOA and PFOS in the blood of nearly all of the people they tested, so over 95%. So I think just about everybody in this room has a little bit of PFAS in them. but it's all dependent on the levels. And the EPA has done a phase out of certain PFAS compounds and chemicals. So over the last several years, we have seen a decrease in the blood levels in us, humans. In lab animals, so we've done quite a bit of studies on lab animals, we have seen that the PFOA and PFOS can cause reproductive, developmental, liver, kidney, immunological effects, and tumors in lab animals, which sounds really scary, but what we've been consistently finding in humans is increased cholesterol levels. That's the most common health effect for humans, but there are some limited studies, limited findings that say that there are lower infant birth weights, harmful effects on immune system, thyroid, liver, and then cancer as well. So these are, as this prevalence of these compounds have come out, we're really starting to the scientific community is really starting to dive into what are the health effects. So it's an ongoing search. So we'll get into the regulations for PFAS, but before we get into that, it's all based on the concentration of what's in the water. So concentration is weight of a substance per unit volume. Usually it's a milligram per liter. That's how we express anything and everything in the laboratory is milligrams per liter. But it's a lot easier to think of it as part per million. So a milligram per liter is equal to a part per million. And as we get lower and lower on the parts per million, part per billion, part per trillion levels, I thought it would be a good way to show you exactly what that means in more day-to-day terms. So a part per million, think about it as 1 second in every 11 and a half days. Parts per billion, 1 second in every 31.7 years. And parts per trillion is 1 second in every 31,700 years. So the parts per trillion is what we're looking at with PFAS. Those are the levels that we're looking at. So that is really, really, really low concentrations. So keep that in mind as we're moving forward, but that's where the levels and the regulatory limits are headed. So how did we get to where we are today? One thing that I really love about the drinking water regulations is the EPA is required to, every 5 years, publish a list of 30 contaminants, and it's part of the unregulated contaminants monitoring rule. So these are contaminants that are emerging contaminants of concern. We want to see what is in the water, how prevalent it is, what the amounts are. So basically they ask all of the water systems to monitor for these contaminants. In 2012, the third UCMR rule came out, and it included 6 PFAS. So at this point, we're just looking to see, is there any prevalence of these chemicals? Do they exist in the water supply? So it's it's research at this point. No regulatory standards, no limits. From 2013 to 15, monitoring was conducted by all public water systems. So that included about 6,000 public water systems across the United States, and monitored for those 6 PFAS. So once we've done all the monitoring across the nation, we've got a ton of results. We have to evaluate them. So based on all of those results, in 2016, the EPA issued a health advisory for PFAS. 70 parts per trillion combined. So again, there's how many PFAS compounds? Thousands. We only monitored 6 of them at this stage. But for the combined levels, it couldn't be more than 70 parts per trillion for this health advisory. Now, keep in mind, health advisories are non-regulatory and they're not enforceable. They're just it's a level at which offers a margin of protection from a lifetime of exposure. So if you're exposed at 70 parts per trillion for your entire life, you'll be okay. So then in July of 2019, the Division of Drinking Water, the DDW, established a response level and interim notification levels. So we're getting into a lot of jargon here. We've got response levels, notification levels, there's a maximum contaminant level. So I apologize for all of these different and conflicting sometimes levels and limits, but this is the path at which we go down to establish limits and what we need to know to test for in the water. So notification levels, they're a health-based advisory level. If you are greater than this notification level, some requirements or recommendations will apply by the DDW. So at this stage in July of 2019, notification level for PFOA is 14 parts per trillion, and for PFOS, 13 parts per trillion. Response level, which is the level at which the DDW recommends taking a water source out of service, is 70 parts per trillion for the combined PFOS. So we're getting pretty low. We're getting into the 13 parts per trillion. 1 month later, in August, DDW revised those notification levels, dropped them even lower. So now we are at 6.1 and 5.1 parts per trillion. So think back to that 1 second in 31,700 years is 1 part per trillion. So now we've got 5 of those, 6 of those seconds. So really, really low levels. In August, they kept the response level the same at 70 for the combined PFOS chemicals. So we've got these notification levels, we've got response levels. What's next? So the next in the regulatory process is to develop public health goals, and that is the level at which a contaminant in drinking water does not pose a significant health risk. And a lot of times, I'll say the next thing first. The maximum contaminant level is typically established soon after. Maximum contaminant level is the highest level at which a contaminant can be present in a water supply. So all water systems must meet that MCL. Public health goals and MCLs tend to go hand in hand, though the values are widely different. So a public health goal, obviously, you don't want anything in there, but what may be allowed is whatever number EPA or DDW develops in the future. So I just threw a ton of notification levels, maximum contaminant levels at you guys. But what I want you guys to remember are these notification levels here. This is what we're looking at this stage in the game. So now that we know what the regulations are, what do we do about it? Well, we got to test for it. So the city's Water Resources Laboratory supports the water and the wastewater sections in all of their analytical testing needs. So when the UCMR3 rule came out in 2012, we obviously had to adhere to that rule. We monitored in 2014, which included sampling for PFOA and PFOS, 2 of the 6 that were required for that monitoring. We collected samples of our treated water at treatment plants and the groundwater wells. And at that time in 2014, all of the PFOS results were below the reporting limit, which is fantastic. Keep in mind, back in 2014, there were no regulatory limits set yet. So the results from the UCMR3 monitoring, 63 water suppliers had detected PFOA and PFOS in their water supplies, and 26 of those were in California. Because of those results, in March of 2019, DDW issued orders to 600 water system sites, this is water sites, not a whole system, to test for PFOS. And those sites were selected based on their risk for potential contamination. So if they had gotten hits in the UCMR3 monitoring, they were going to be required to test again, or if they were near a water supply that had gotten a hit, or if they were nearby a manufacturing manufacturer that had PFAS. So that's how those were determined. Those sites were selected. Good news is, City of Santa Barbara did not receive an order from DDW because we didn't have any detections in our water from the first round of testing. But we wanted to be proactive about our testing. Since this has been such a big item in the news, we wanted to make sure that our community was well aware of what was in our water supplies. And we wanted to know as well. So we wanted to see how close to those newly imposed lower limits we were. In 2014, as part of the UCMR 3 monitoring, the reporting or the results were less than 20 ppt and less than 40 ppt. So fast forward to 2019, where we are now, the limits are 5.1 and 6.5. So we're at, goodness, 20 times lower. So we wanted to be proactive. Yes, we knew we didn't have any hits at the higher levels, but let's see what we are when these limits have come way down. So from September through December of this year, lab staff went out and collected PFAS samples from all of our water system sources. And we monitored for 17 PFAS compounds. The first round we did was for only 6. Now we're monitoring for 17. We collected samples at the surface water treatment plant and the desalination plant. All of our groundwater wells, so all of those that Dakota had just touched on, we had sampled at. And we also collected at our wastewater treatment plant, some at various locations. One thing to note with the sample collection of these PFAS, because it's in everything, the sample collection, it makes me smile because you shouldn't be wearing lipstick or personal care products. You shouldn't have any clothes that have been laundered with fabric softener. Don't have any prepackaged food prior to sampling. I mean, the list was just insane. I joked with my staff, don't shower today because you have to sample. So it's just everywhere. So it was very difficult to obtain a very representative sample, just because it's everywhere. So I apologize for the very small list there, but you will see NDs on just about every single one. So ND means non-detect. So as a reminder, our health advisory level from the EPA is 70 parts per trillion. Notification level of when we should notify our customers that there is any of these in the water is at 5.1, 6.5 parts per trillion. And then the response level to remove a water source from service is 70. You will see there, we're waiting for results for one more. Results take 6 weeks to get back. And all of the PFOA and all of the PFOS were non-detect at less than 2 parts per trillion. We had, you can see the total PFOS, which we're allowed to have up to 70. We got a 2.2. So again, with the extreme precautions that need to be made with the sampling, that 0.2 of a second in 31,000 years, we're resampling. So we've resampled to verify if there's actually anything in there or if that was a potential sample contamination issue. So as Joshua mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, all of our water sources are below our notification and response levels, which is really wonderful to get these results back and see that, because it's been so much in the news, and it is so super scary if it is present in the water. So the only one we're waiting for is, I think desal treated, and we're just waiting results. Looks like everything is going to be right on par, because in the raw water, so the seawater, there's nothing in there, so we don't anticipate it in the treated water either. So how do we reduce our exposure? Well, we don't have it in our water, so that's fabulous news for us. But if customers still are nervous about it, couple of ways to remove it are through reverse osmosis and activated carbon filters. One of the great things about our surface water treatment plants, desalination has reverse osmosis, and our Cater surface water plant uses activated carbon filters. So even if we were to detect it in our raw water sources, we would be able to remove it. And these are two of the most effective ways to remove PFAS from water. Know what's in your water. Again, like I said, it's not in ours, so we don't have much to worry about. One thing was dust more frequently was a recommendation, just because it's everywhere. I mean, if you've got stain-resistant carpet and, you know, those little fibers come up in the dust as you vacuum, dust more frequently. And then I know it's just everywhere, so it's almost impossible to avoid. And then aside from reducing it in your exposure from water, is watch out for prepackaged foods. Microwave popcorn bags. That one makes me really sad. I love my popcorn while watching football. Takeout containers, fast food wrappers. Avoid stain-resistant clothes and carpets. Check your personal care products to see if there's any fluorinated carbon compounds. Avoid Teflon and non-stick cookware, which, let's face it, that makes doing dishes easy. And then wash your hands before every meal. So I think moving forward. So where does that take us? We don't have any in our water. Great news. But there is going to be continued research and study to understand the toxicity to humans as they are exposed to it. Additional regulations will be forthcoming from DDW and the EPA. I anticipate a maximum contaminant level will be issued probably in the next year. And the city will continue to test our water sources as necessary. If they get into those really, really low levels below what we're seeing now, we'll have to retest to see if we're at those levels as well. And then we're going to communicate to our community that we are the water safe. There's nothing to worry about as far as our water sources go. So
it starts with today.
Yes.
And that's doing this, putting this presentation together, making this council or this water commission meeting available for people to view as well, and just wanting to make sure that our community feels safe.
And I understand that was a lot of technical stuff, so please shoot the questions off.
Got questions, Commissioner Davis?
I have a comment. One, great presentation. I liked all the technical detail. And you went to your chemistry nerd side. So I put on my demographer glasses, and when you tell me that PFAS and blood levels are going down, given the bioaccumulation and the fact that those baby boomers grew up in this period of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we're dying. And so, of course, those are going to go down. It's just the regulation works in that regard. And so check me for PFAS, mercury, microplastics,
Yes.
and that's holding me together today. So anyway, I want to just compliment you. Great presentation. Thank you.
I agree. Really excellent presentation, and I think it's too bad Dr. Keller's not here to hear this. Was his big topic, but he'll be able to reference it, and so will the public. And really excellent and thorough descriptions of why and how you test it and the results. What do you attribute it to that we have zero? Is it that we haven't had industrial uses over our groundwater, or what can we do to be sure we stay in this status?
A lot of the prevalence in the water has been contamination to groundwater sites. Firefighting foam is one of the big contaminants, so a lot of those sites that had gotten orders were nearby airports that had groundwater wells, or they were near large manufacturing companies that were discharging that into some sort of runoff. So we just haven't had that type of industry in Santa Barbara, so it's really great in that fashion.
Well, and I think also to speak to the last item when we talked about how our groundwater basins are kind of structured, allows for that protection. We certainly don't take water from that upper producing zone, and there may be contaminants in there, but we're fortunate enough to have a more pristine lower section or lower groundwater that we pull from. We have the San Ynez River, and there's really no development upstream of that. So we really are fortunate, I guess, in that sense.
Thank you.
Any question? Good presentation. Thank you. I noticed in the table we test and it's non-detect, like below 2. Like, how low can you actually test for this stuff?
Science is changing every day. So that has been one of the big pushes from the water suppliers is you guys, DDW and EPA were pushing down these limits, yet the science behind it wasn't there yet. So initially with the first round of testing in 2014-ish, we were at 20, 40 parts per trillion. Between 2014 and 2019, when they had adjusted the regulations, science really caught up to it, and so they were able to get more developed detection instruments to get down to that lower level.
All right. Super.
So one thing I'm confused about, if it's everywhere I'm rolling around with a popcorn bag all my life, how come you don't get higher elevations in treatment tests? It's an accumulation of everybody in the city playing with all this stuff.
In
treatment water.
In treatment.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. And it's like the same as
yes.
the water source, right?
So that's why we tested the wastewater,
Yeah.
because right now the drinking water is the big thing in the
Right.
news. Hey, you're ingesting this through drinking water, but as we move forward with our raw water augmentation and just indirect potable reuse, that is going to be a big issue.
Seems odd, you wash your hands after handling the
Right.
popcorn bag,
Right. Where does it
multiplied
go?
times 90,000,
Yes.
it's gone into the treatment water. And,
Exactly.
yeah.
So I've noticed that the regulations for drinking water have come through quite rapidly, but wastewater they're aware of it. The wastewater regulations are coming. So
Then
Michael, it's just staying in your body. It's
That's
just not
great.
going out.
I'm the right
thank you
age.
for hanging
and I'm-
on to it.
And I'm the right age
See you
for
later.
that, right? It should be me, right? And the other suggestion I have is, in addition to today, I'd encourage you either to put a bullet point positive presentation on the city's website under water, and maybe also put even something a little smaller than that with a link on Nextdoor
Okay.
before some enthusiastic person on Nextdoor decides to run with 800 comments off into the world is ending, as they tend to do. But just because there's people out there who are just going to see what they want to see and run with the world is ending.
Yes.
So, and it's clear it's not. So,
All right. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was very informative. Okay, we've got 8 minutes left and 20 minutes left on our agenda. So let's see what we can, I know. Hey, it's important things still. Water agency update. Miss Taylor, I think you're up. We can skip it if there isn't one.
I'm sorry, I've come unprepared. Didn't realize I was on the agenda.
We let's see, what do we have to talk about on this? Is there anything to report out? We can talk about the Kachuma contract. So we haven't heard anything. We call monthly to the county, who is the contract holder, and we are all waiting for a bond, a basis of negotiation from the Bureau. And we have yet to see that. And it's basically what we assume is going to be the contract that they give to pretty much every one of their agencies that they work with. I do think that there's an interest on the county's part for this to be some massive change in the way that the lake is managed, but the current contract has served us well. There are certainly things that would be nice to address in it, such as evaporation. For those who remember, as the lake got down to 30,000 acre feet, the evaporation formula kind of blew up, and we had to adopt a different one. So making that adopted formula part of how we manage the reservoir. But I'm guessing the Bureau is going to want to make this a fairly simple change, because for the most part the contract works as it is. So I'm not sure why it's taking them so long. Currently, I'm thinking all they can do right now is a renewal, just because the planning process for what we understood is clearly not going to fit in the 9 months that we really have left to before it expires in September. So
All I can add to that is that we are planning on writing them a letter saying that we are fine with the current contract, so please don't rush anything on our behalf, but if you do plan sweeping changes, we would like to see some information from them now.
Do you have a question? No? Comment?
I just want to add, I didn't bring my notes from the COMB meeting Monday, but also all of the fish passage crossings, the Kyoto Creek crossings, those are all complete now. So that has been a long-term project, and it's really great news that those are finally done and really successful. So just add.
Thank you.
we,
Okay.
Ready for the next
Okay.
yep.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. We can leave it at that. We don't have to. We don't have to go everything. There's no updates. Okay. Subcommittee reports. Sea
Okay,
level rise.
sea level rise. The draft adaptation plan is scheduled to come out to become public in mid to late January. Probably early February, my guess is really where it's going to come out. Then we're going to go into a period February through April where we'll be going out to the public in boards and committees, and they'll be coming here to make a detailed presentation to us. In May, it'll come back to us at the Sea Level Rise Committee, to council in the summer. That's a general framework. When it comes to you, there is within the plan, near-term adaptation plan. It identifies doing detailed studies, both alternatives and engineering studies for the wastewater and water infrastructure in the immediate waterfront. Specifically, the big item being the wastewater pipe that comes through West Beach. That's a big dog, as well as some flood proofing of El Estero in that regard. The question obviously came up earlier is like, whether those engineering studies would fall within, again, the 3-year period we're looking at for rate changes. And again, TBD as we get out into the springtime in that regard, but that's something to be looking forward to. So again, becoming public in early February, come to the committee probably in April, somewhere along there, and back to council in the summertime. That's it.
I think that's the only subcommittee we've had. So thank you very much. Okay. Water Resources Managers Report.
All right. I'm not going to really spend too much time. We've added a few new slides and we've shortened it, added a few slides to the manager's report that I wanted to just point out. We are still working on some of these. One of them is the recycled water production. I think we could still work on this some more. We're trying to show trends here, but we're also trying to show, not lose the blending element of it. Currently, recycled water production has been strong. We're currently still stress testing that. And then on the next page, we have slip. And again, one thing that we're trying to work on here is trying to be able to convey how much workload there currently is with slip, and where our current customers are with going through the slip process. Wanting to kind of start showing progress as to what we have and where we're headed with this program as we hope to start to get some more staffing to support this. And then the last wing, which there's actually, I'm happy to report, says on here that we've had 4 spills. It's actually 3. Yesterday, I just got confirmation that this spill that was in December does not qualify as a spill. Yes. Long story I won't go into, but we're standing at 3 right now. So we have a few more that we've met with Chair Bernie on that we're still working on developing, and we'll hopefully make it into this packet. And we want to continue to refine this to make it something that works. A few little things I wanted to touch on. Desal intake pipeline. We had a leak on Tuesday morning. It's actually not on a vital section of the pipeline. It's hard to explain, but this is part of the old piping that was existing, and we are working on isolating that section and trying to get it back online. We've got some kind of special parts we need to order for it. So we're working on that. We're anticipating somewhere around 10 days to kind of finish that and get that back up and running. You may see some hub about some work that was done up near Tunnel Trail. SCE was clearing the road to access their power poles, and they have an easement. It's city property, but they have an easement across that property. It's in the county. SCE went through their permitting process. We were unaware that they were doing the work, but apparently they did some pretty aggressive road clearing, and it's gotten a lot of people talking. So I'm not fully up to speed, but I just wanted to give you that is not, the city was not up there doing that work. And to our understanding, we don't believe any of our infrastructure was damaged because it's right around where Mission Tunnel comes out of the hill. We have no major items for January, not to mention we're going to be off here for a week and a half or so, and so I am proposed canceling the January 2020 meeting unless there was any desire to
No
meet.
objection.
Okay. That would make... I also wanted to report that our NPDES permit got approved on Friday before the regional board. It was great, and I want to give a special thanks out to Galen Fair and Todd Heldorn, who did an amazing job putting that detailed presentation together. And with that, I want to both recognize Commissioner Jordan and also introduce our new commissioner, Jeff Young. And before I do that, I want to recognize Mr. Jordan has been on our commission now for almost 5 years. And I still scratch my head at why he wanted to join the commission during the worst part of the drought. Talk about public service. But he joined, and I am just indebted that you wanted to be part of this group during some really difficult discussions that we had. And, we're glad you're going to be continuing to work closely with us on stuff, but we wanted to recognize your service to the Water Commission. It was invaluable, and we'll look forward to you reading our recommendations when we send
Thank
those
you. Let
on
me
to you.
stop you there. I just want to share that I have frequently over the past several months used this particular commission as, between Creeks Planning Commission and this as one of the examples of one of the things I'm most proud of. So, 3 or 4 years ago, it was just in my vernacular, a group of really old white males sitting in a room where nobody knew where they were, having a meeting, hidden from the public. Then, of course, the drought started, and people started, Megan joined, Dave joined, Ms. Sneddon was elected, and I joined. And the results 4 years later are a set date with a public hearing, more transparency to the public. I think both good and bad, more pressure on staff to answer to very engaged people. And it just seems like the evolution to me, whether drought or non-drought, just in terms of the subject matter, has been one of the greatest successes that I've been part of in my connection with the city. So, and then I also want to say I've had the pleasure of working with Jeff Young for 4 years on the regional board, and I think I'm looking forward. He is way smarter than me, way smarter in particular water jargon than me. I'll work on him for the common man connection. But I think you guys are going to be really happy to have his participation, and I don't think he'll miss a beat sitting in this chair. So thanks.
One little add, I do appreciate this, is in running for council member, his position here at the Water Commission was also coming to an end, and whether or not to reapply to the Water Commission was something he was bouncing around. He's like, well, I don't know where I'm going to be. And at the end of the day, I love this. He's like, well, I want to give back to this community no matter where I'm at. And so I'm going to apply for both. I'm going to be either a water commissioner or I'm going to be a council member. And I think that just speaks volumes to just his commitment to this community. And I do appreciate that. And I appreciate all the, your commitment to here. Just thank you.
I want to second Joshua's gratitude to Commissioner Jordan. It's been wonderful serving on the commission with you, and I love your kind of everyman grocery store line comments. Always appreciate what you hear from folks, and your perspective, and also kind of your broad reach and interest in this issue. So thank you so much. You will be missed here, but we're excited to have you on City Council. We hope so. Thank you very much.
So with that, we have some coffee and pastries that should be showing up anytime. We hope you all can stick around and celebrate with us.